everybody? Bo Billington with the Free Agent Podcast. I got Steve Quehl here. Steve, thanks for joining us. This is the second time.
My pleasure. Glad to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. So the topic for today is we're talking about acquisitions, and in particular how acquisitions can affect sales teams and how sales leaders, presidents, CEOs, maybe even private equity could navigate integrations that go on, because there are impacts. There's personnel impacts, there's turnover, there's a lot of implications when these acquisitions happen. In fact, I've actually been through one myself, and I'll talk about that later. But really wanted to have you on, Steve. And I think this is extremely topical now, considering just the environment that we're in and what's going on, because there's a tremendous amount of turbulence out there, not only from an economic perspective, but also from an employment perspective. People don't understand if they're coming or going, and which way the sun sets anymore. So thanks for joining. Really appreciate your time today.
The point is, I think we in this profession, and I'm referring now to the technology world specifically, and within that, the impact on sales performance and sales productivity, we live in interesting times. There's a huge ecosystem here with regard to the world of finance that we're experiencing, and companies obtaining capital from the outside are undergoing extreme pressure. We know for a fact that in 2022, a lot of companies who had gone public in the prior 3 years, I'm talking about tech companies again,
sure,
burned through a ton of cash and ended up sort of flat on their back for a period of time, only to have the bottom drop out of the financial markets. Certainly in venture capital, we saw a precipitous decline in venture capital. And since you and I agreed to have this conversation, what have we seen but a massive disruption in the banking economy? Right. In the technology, in the world of general high finance, which would clearly is going to have an impact on private equity, among other things as well. My son-in-law is a very well-known partner with a prestigious M&A law firm. And he's seen the bottom drop out of their pipelines for M&A transactions. So where does that leave companies looking for capital in the business combinations that might have otherwise taken place? It's not going to stop them, but there's going to be a flight to quality. There has been a flight to quality from the standpoint of the investors. Sure. They're keeping powder dry. They're sort of pulling their horns in, looking into their own portfolios, making sure those folks are sound before they go off and start seeding other businesses. So what does that mean for companies that are attempting to grow, right, and get access to capital? So that's one issue. I think in terms of our what we're seeing out there, whether it's a function of companies deciding to merge, as you point out in your opening remarks, companies decide to come together, what's a function of acquisition for strategic purposes, larger companies acquiring smaller companies. There are multiple reasons for that. Again, financial pressures could have a bearing on timing or motivation, right? Valuations notwithstanding. But be that as it may, what's going to happen when they bring those companies together? That's the question on the table. What happens when you bring two organizations that have otherwise been in market, selling, producing, product and winning customers, and all of a sudden there's a decision to combine forces? If that's the general framework for the discussion, what do we have to look out for? Sure. What are the elements or the issues that have to be secured? And what are the obstacles that have to be overcome? What are the problems that have to be prevented? I think that becomes a matter of discussion. And again, I look at it, purely from the standpoint of the customer-facing side of the equation, right, where the growth is going to come from. After all, it's all about revenue. It's all about obtaining, more revenue and revenue in a growth context, so that there's return on that investment in that merger acquisition. But that it has to go beyond the conversation around finances and the financial implications of this, because you're going to deal with people. in this.
Sure.
So what you have to ultimately steel yourself against is inevitable clashes of culture, which could lead to talent loss, which is already epidemic. I
Mhm.
mean, we're living in the highest, most volatile period of turnover, I think, in the history of the sales profession, from what I can see right now. Much of which will come from, exacerbating or misaligning objectives, or misaligning or having processes that are out of sync or out of date,
Right.
having technology that is either redundant or worse, conflicting, having metrics that don't really establish the true guideposts for the growth of the business. So I think those are things that have to be managed. But again, back to the first of all, the people side of the equation, and pause me if you think I'm running off in the wrong direction here. But you think about the people side of the equation. And, any business combination is not just a merger of assets, or an investment in technology or an entry into a market. It's a combination of people, and
100%.
people, therefore, you're attempting a fusion of attitudes, of loyalties, of experience.
Cultures. I mean, it could be
A
competitive
whole,
companies,
you bet.
could be
And
adjacent industries, a lot of factors.
so when you think about it, when the investors or the executive management and the boards are sitting there looking at it as a financial transaction, what you really have to ascertain is how well are you equipped to manage the leadership challenges that will come out of this, and overcoming these natural human, issues, so that the human performance is accretive as well as the financial performance. And I think that's what we're trying to establish here. So,
Yeah.
and ultimately, you're also, think about this, you're ultimately combining your buyers, who again are people
Right.
who are used to things having a certain way. And so all this goes to the point where, before and after the fact, we're going to have announcements of this. We're going to bring these companies together. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great in the morning, as we say. And all that hype is going to prevent. But before we even get there, there's going to be preconceived notions about winners and losers. And so the people are going to wonder on both sides, whether you're an acquirer or you're being acquired,
Sure.
what's the impact of change? What is the effect of this change?
Yeah, no, agreed. I think that's a good tee up. I've actually been through a private equity acquisition, and it was horrific. I ended up leaving after, I think, about 6 months, because everything changed. There's not a lot of guidance from executive leadership on how this acquisition was going to affect us, and where were we going over the next 1, 3, 5 years, what were the benefits, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so I feel like a lot of leadership teams can drop the ball in that regard, is not communicating well. But you brought up something really interesting about kind of, it being about the people. And I feel like far too many, acquires, for whatever reason. It's a financial decision, maybe it's a product decision, but it really is people, especially too, when maybe you're in a competitive environment. And then now there's like redundant jobs, redundant personnel. And if that's the case, that can really drive panic through the sales organization, and people go from being productive to maybe looking and caring only about self-preservation, which to me would mean I'm going to go find another job because this
Right.
is very turbulent and I don't feel safe. So, also too, what interesting point is, like, you've got two inherently different cultures because they're different companies. It's like merging of families, right?
Yes.
So let's kind of dig in a little bit on maybe like the culture side of the house, and what could companies do to safeguard maybe their unique cultures, or bring two inherently different cultures together and bridge that gap.
Well, I think what's really important is remembering what each culture in its own respect, was intended to supply or perform,
Mhm.
and what was it built around. And not to be overly controversial here, but unless that culture was directed at the profitable attraction and growth of satisfied customers,
Mhm.
then you've got an issue anyway, because I think any business has to be driven by the ability to build its customer base, maintain its customer base. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the gold, right? That's where the revenue will come from. That's where the market share will come from. Whatever that, it's going to come from those customers. So culture needs to be tuned to the buyer. So to answer your question, I think we have to step back, whether now we've got two audiences coming together, get them to reflect, first of all, on their own culture with respect to how they were intended to perform against that objective of bringing satisfied customers to bear. And then coming together and recognizing what's common among both groups, what's different. The discussion that ensues from that, I think, will highlight where some of the gaps or holes are, but ensure that you're doing that, before you've got to go to market the next morning, right? I mean, so there's something that you've got to ascertain early on. And I think this is, again, from the standpoint of sales, because you've got a whole company here, not just sales. You've got product development, you've got, the back office functions, all those things. It's all at work before us. But I'm looking now at that, again, sales-driven side of this, because that's where the revenue and the growth objective is going to be met. You've got to take stock and audit the territory level performance and understand how and why the buyers buy, why they buy from you versus someone else, and what's going to contribute to their buying now from an entity that's become different. We really need to also step back and look at because you mentioned some things like the idea of people fearing for their jobs or losing their jobs. Right. We're already in turmoil with respect to turnover in the sales before these kinds of events take place. The Great Resignation.
Just to kind of put a footnote there, I think it's less than a year for around account executives, and then kind of your entry level, and then as it pertains to senior leadership, VP and above, the average tenure is around like 13, 14, 15 months, somewhere in there, which is ridiculous. And but then companies don't want to hire job jumpers, yet they've created an environment where people are going to jump. So it's a mess.
So you're compounding risk is what I'm saying. You're compounding risk when you're bringing this together, which is more of an impetus to go back and look at your current environment and your current processes and determine how they can best be evolved. Because that's what this is going to be. They're going to be evolved to address whatever new exigencies arise from this merger. We know for a fact that the cost of sales is always one of the key things that the financial side of the house looks at.
Right.
But there's nothing more expensive than recruiting a new hire and then putting someone on board who's not adept at the job yet. Because he talked about the turnover rate or the tenure. Yes, the turnover is less than 18 months time-wise, but it usually takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 to 30 months for someone to become truly productive in their job.
Right. So there's a huge opportunity cost.
It's a ramp time. You've got a ramp time to manage, right?
Yeah.
So it goes back to the point is you can't afford to lose anybody here at this juncture because it's going to cost us more to build it. And, unless we decide that someone is not contributing or can't contribute, then we should, do what we can to maintain the top performers. Obviously, you're always looking to replace or upscale or up-level your people. Right. Maybe there are some people that don't belong anymore, but that's a decision to be made in every circumstance, in every situation, right? You're always looking at who your top players are, and you want to retain those first and foremost. Because another issue that we've got here is quota performance across the board. Right. Fewer than 40%, 47% of people today in the sales profession make quota, right? Which automatically says
that means also too that that's just pie in the sky BS. And the millennials are trying to change that, where there's going to be less of the upside and more of like, hey, just give me a higher salary with like a 20-30% bonus versus a 50-50 split. And candidly, I don't necessarily disagree with that thinking. Again, taking into consideration your point and the data you just suggested that 48% of people do not hit quota. Either it's just pie in the sky numbers, or companies aren't doing a good job of putting the right people in the right seats.
Yep. But coming back to the other thing, back to the issue, you have you have the people coming together, you've got your sales processes to be addressed here, but now you got to go and step into another aspect of the sales culture, the sales climate that we're in today that has changed so dramatically certainly in the last decade, and that's how buyers buy. I
Right.
mean, and if we're not accounting for the fact that and now again here we're referring to the B2B sales, right? We're not talking B2C. We're talking more of a complex B2B sales environment. Studies and audits and discussions across the board from organizations like Gartner and others come back and say buyers are tired of dealing with salespeople,
Yeah.
right? Because salespeople, frankly, have been going after this and going at it the wrong way for a long time and not achieving those results we talked about, but they haven't been achieving the results for a reason. And we see buyers stepping back, and because the salespeople themselves are no longer the sole brokers of information
Right.
and that trust in the company's value proposition. They're making decisions without salespeople.
Sure.
68% without have made decisions. But another factor too, because of the complexity of the buying decisions, again, B2B sales, end-to-end processes, long sales cycles, 45% of those buying decisions end up with no decision. They can't conclude. They can't reach a decision. So all this presents huge challenge, a hurdle for organizations of any caliber to come into and adapt to, much less organizations that are coming together and managing their own internal chaos. So you want to understand this going in. You want to be able to address this going in and come back to your sales processes that keep in mind how buyers buy, why buyers will buy from you versus the competition, and what you can do to engender those trust relationships so that they're dealing with you out of loyalty. They're dealing with you in terms of knowing that you're going to help them get their jobs done and they can sleep tight.
Understood. So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about a company where scenario the acquisitions happened. There's two different teams that are coming together. How can they ensure that they maintain the top producers, the right leaders, and that people don't start panicking and try to move out of the door, move out the door to another role.
Okay. I think we talk about something here again, in terms of sales management in the last decade. One of the things we've lost is a focus on benchmarking and planning. Mm-hmm. But I think this calls for the answer to this question calls for very specific and very rigorous plans, detailed plans to be created in 4 specific areas, right? Okay. First and foremost, again, back to the whole company model that we were discussing, there has to be a detailed plan for the integration of the firms, and with a focus on the cultural integration specifically here, so that you don't end up with this turbulence, this disruption among the people. Mm-hmm. You have to address the timelines. How long is it going to take, to bring people up to speed? You have to address milestones. We have to have achievement levels at some point to make sure we're on track. And those metrics those KPIs that we are addressing now that are common between the organizations. So we have not only shared values, but shared metrics that are understood and agreed upon. So there's certainly some discussion and planning and training that has to be, because not everybody's going to understand, the entirety of that at the outset. So you don't want to walk into this the day of the merger and roll this out. You want to have this prepared in advance. I think another area that you need a specific plan is for that talent retention specifically, knowing that's high risk. You're automatically dealing in a high risk scenario. Mm-hmm. There's no substitute for good communication. There's no substitute for expressing the value that you place on the people and expressing that so that they understand and appreciate that they are valued. Right. And to that extent, that there's a feedback loop. They have the ability not just to be told what to do, but to contribute in some respect. Now, it's not a democracy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but the idea that some of these folks have been at this for a while in different companies, there's experience in there that we want to avail ourselves of. having that feedback loop is important. I think at that point too, and back to some of the milestones and metrics, we need to tie specific compensation drivers to this so
Right.
that when milestones and opportunities are otherwise met, even though they may not result in pure revenue specifically, that there's a compensation here. So they begin to see that they're going to be compensated or rewarded in exchange for their patience and their growth through this process. Another area for a specific plan is the sales process alignment. And here again, I'm talking about understanding and accommodating how buyers buy. Remember, it's no longer the sales organization that's in control of the buying process. Those days are gone. The buyers are in control. Understanding the buyer. And if we're merging companies and we're merging separate sets of buyers, we may have to come now to an understanding of the nuances or the differences that may be existing. But auditing those processes, auditing the means by which we capture data around those processes. In other words, the technology, whether it's the sales operation function that exists today, how are we processing a lead from start to finish? How are we doing handoffs? What are those KPIs that exist, and those the alignment that we have between, for example, sales and marketing function and operations and customer success.
Right.
But auditing that end-to-end process so that we come full circle with a buyer from lead to cash and repeat. And how is that being done? How will that be done? Has to be documented. And then we have to turn it into a teachable moment and begin to instruct and make companies or make the participants aware of what it is we're going to do here with the tools and the training to show them how they're going to move from lead to cash, what their obligation is, what they can anticipate in terms of responses, what they can have in terms of support within the organization. That all has to be hand-fed to them at the outset to see it's part of the what's in it for them.
Sure.
What am I going to get? Am I out on an island alone trying to make relationships happen, or do I have a force behind me? I mean, this is the moment where you express your ability to help them address that. We're not taking over their jobs. We're not doing their jobs for them. We expect them to do the heavy lifting, but there is air support. There's air support here. Is the point. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just a couple. I want to unpack that a little bit, just so we can kind of focus in on a couple different areas. So quite interesting, and ultimately, as it pertains to kind of the executive leadership, and I hate this seems so cliche now, but it's like almost explaining the why to the team, why the acquisition happened, and to your point a few moments ago, what's in it for the salesperson? How is this going to be a benefit, as well as allow them to kind of perform at a higher level and have maybe more tools in the toolbox. Additionally, too, you mentioned compensation alignment, and I feel like a lot of companies miss the boat here, be it acquisition or not within an acquisition. And a lot of times the compensation is literally tied to the wrong metrics that then ends up having the an unintended consequence of salespeople doing the wrong things. And so right. I think that's extremely important when integrating two organizations, is that the compensation is aligned, but also that it makes sense. It ties to the actual objectives of the organization, and you get positive, good behavior that you want from the salespeople, and not them looking to kind of game the system and hurt the brand equity and the overall kind of positioning of the company.
Indeed. And so what's the best way to ensure that that's transmitted and also reinforced? Well, you have to step back and look at the leadership in the sales organization, the sales management itself, which has been subject to significant deficiencies in the past decade. The time spent coaching, mentoring, the time spent investing in training and not doing the job for the salespeople, but participating with them and helping them do their jobs better, measuring them, leveling them up, and supporting them in their drive to obtain that compensation, right?
Right.
but then aligning compensation across not only levels of sales management, right, but then across functions within the organization who are in support of sales, including, for example, marketing and sales ops
Mhm.
and customer success. Funny things happen when people are going to get paid on the same number,
Yeah.
right? They all line up.
Agreed.
When everybody when you got lone rangers out there, when you got people that are, not my job, or it's his fault, or the leads are crappy, or you didn't follow up, you can't have that, pointing at each other. If everybody's got to be in alignment there. Compensation is one of the mechanisms that enable you to do that. But again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's got to be
Right.
done and reinforced every day, because again, in a 5, 8, 9 month sales cycle lead time, so much is happening in building from the outset. It's all a set of building blocks that have to be set in place. And any one, you've got a Jenga game going on. If it gets pulled out, the whole thing collapses. You've lost 9 months. You're starting over with a new customer. It's expensive. So
Yeah. I, you know,
every customer opportunity is a gold mine.
No, I totally agree, and definitely mirror your thoughts as it pertains to like the incentives. And I've never understood why marketing, doesn't have the same incentives that maybe sales does. And so they're kind of, working in a vacuum or a
Right.
silo doing their thing, while sales is doing something different. And then maybe you have product that's working on something that doesn't even, resonate with their customer base. And so you've got these three parties that are almost working independently. Left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, and then the compensation's not aligned, and it's a mess. And to your point, I mean, companies that are not acquiring one, need to focus on that. But then, of course, too, it compounds risk, to use your phrase earlier. When you're acquiring another company, it becomes that much more complex. Ergo, alignment across the board is super, super important. One quick segue is we're running out of time here, but what are some warning signs to look out for, maybe when companies are in the midst of acquiring another, and integrations going south? Like, is it like turnover? Salespeople not hitting their number? Is it leads not being converted? What are some thoughts that some companies could look out from that perspective?
Well, I think it's all the above. Some of these symptoms are probably already occurring in the individual companies prior to the acquisition. There was a compelling reason for them to join forces to begin with. And again, what are we trying to do here but to accrete the response here in terms of performance. But again, back to the core issues that I mentioned. We've already got issues in the world of sales, primarily because of how buyers are buying, right? We've got to go back and examine that. So if we are feeling and seeing resistance from the buyers in accepting our outreach of whatever fashion that is, whether it's cold calls, email, whatever, I think that's a signal. Those leads that are coming in that aren't being addressed or managed properly, certainly that's a signal. But I think it's regardless of, we have that going on now. The only what we would know is that it would only get worse when we compound the buyer's problems and look at us and say, okay, here's a change. Do I want to do this? Right. So
Right.
communicating with those buyers will be very important. Extending the relationships that already exist and passing through and making sure that those are going to survive, I think up front is another part of this gambit as well. So I think that needs to be done. But there's lots of telltale signs. The problem, and again, I don't want to oversimplify or over preach, but these telltale signs are everywhere. They're in plain sight today. And if you're contemplating a merger, acquisition, combination of forces, you are only going to pour gasoline on the fire if you don't address them early on. Look inward, look into your sales functions, understand who your buyers are, understand the experience level of your people and their ability to understand how and why those buyers buy. Have we done enough to make them aware of that? Have we held them accountable for taking the right steps and doing the right things and addressing those buyer processes and needs? And so if we're gonna bring companies together, will both sides of the equation be able to match or measure up to those expectations? I don't know
Yeah,
if I answered your question there, but I don't.
yeah, no, you did. I mean, but net, it's a tremendous amount of effort, huge undertaking. It sounds like.
Yep.
And would you suggest that companies hire, outsourced chief revenue officers such as yourself that can kind of come in, create the blueprint, ensure that organizations are aligned from top to bottom and then across the different silos, but then also kind of put together playbooks, not just from a compensation perspective, but also like customer personas, who should engage with what customers at
Yep.
what time, which group, et cetera.
Well, thank you for leading the witness because those are exactly the things that you would want to anticipate.
Yeah.
Certainly today, again, because of the changing nature of sales and sales organizations, sales leadership, what's often helpful is to find someone who's been there, done that, and
Agreed.
been in the situation, understands the ramifications. A little gray hair can't hurt, but more importantly, the understanding and empathy and awareness of what happens across functional boundaries. So someone who's been, as myself, as you have, a former CSO, a former CEO, you can look at it from different vantage points and see what's going to happen here. And you're going to be, you're going to be less judgmental because you're going to understand again what has to occur across these functional boundaries as well.
Right.
But then in the midst of it all, help people see by helping them anticipate what's going to happen if something doesn't occur. So what's going to go wrong if this doesn't happen versus what will go right if it does. And I think there's help in that regard. But we can also be eyes and ears, an opinion here that's neutral, that can help management, boards, investors
Right.
see what's right and what needs to change, and do so in a dispassionate manner rather than someone who's got a political agenda. I think that's a useful or helpful idea as well.
No, I think you nailed it, and that's how I envision all executive engagements from an interim perspective play out. That they're an objective observer, objective advisor. There's no political games. All they want to do is do good work, and they're an independent third party that's observing and trying to kind of cobble together a blueprint. So, Steve, really appreciate it. So, how can people find you?
I can give you my email address here. It's srquehl, Quehl, at hickorypartners.net.
Excellent.
And my phone number is, don't spam me, but it's 404-386-1924.
Excellent. And we'll be sure to put it in the video as well. Steve, really appreciate you taking the time today. Sincerely. Thanks so much. Again,
Great.
super topical, super interesting, especially when considering all the turnover, all the turbulence, just kind of the economic conditions that we're in. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thanks,
All right,
Bo.
man. Thank
Take
you.
care.